All right, welcome to the 845th Cooper Conference. My name is Mickey Pierce, and I am not your room monitor. Standing up here with me is the esteemed John Misla from San Diego County. He will do most of the talking today. I will just provide comic relief. So anything you learn or don't learn will be his fault. Yeah, we'd just like to welcome you to TIERED permitting, and that being said, ready to roll, John?
Yeah.
All right, then let's get at it.
Okay. A little bit about our backgrounds. I've been doing TIERED permitting since the beginning, back in 93, 94. Been with the San Diego County CUPA since 1987, so a few years. Each of our groups have a different assignment. Mine's hazardous waste technical lead for our county. So I work mostly with hazardous waste generators and treatment, and everything kind of related to waste classification. So I enjoy this class. We've done this a bit, like 5 times. And we haven't changed much. We're going to think about changing it again next year. But we get some feedback on your evaluations. We want to do like more pictures next time and more case studies and stuff like that. But we're going to go through the basics over the next, 12 hours? Okay, 4 hours now. Okay. So we're going to go through the, what is TIERED permitting for the, basically go through the different tiers, talk about some definitions, exemptions, specific requirements for each tier, PBR being the higher tier in terms of requirements, and notification for SIRS, common violations and resources and tools. So that's sort of what we're going to be covering. Anytime you have questions, feel free just to raise your hand, shout them out. At the roster, there's probably about 90% of the roster is inspectors. So I'm very interested in hearing, some of your stories, some of your opinions and observations for your CUPA. But it's a lot of inspectors that signed up for the class. So. From experience, during inspections, we get, facility operators sort of get a little bit agitated when you ask about treatment. They say the sewer district regulates them. Why do they need a TIERED permit from the CUPA? They come from another state. EPA doesn't regulate on-site treatment the way California does, so they're wondering why. Waste is not hazardous. That's a common thing we sometimes hear. What they do is not treatment, and even though they're doing pH adjustment, metal flocculation, things like that. Recycling, you hear that sometimes. So I don't need a treatment TIERED permit notification because I recycle a significant percentage of my waste. And it's not a waste until it discharges into the sewer. I hear that several times. So they do the sample after they did treatment, meets POTW discharge limits, and they believe that they're okay. Why do we regulate hazardous waste treatment in California? Well, it really goes back to the law. And the philosophy of the state is to regulate, hazardous waste in all aspects: generation, storage, transfer, transportation, treatment, and disposal. So California has always had that philosophy going back to the late 70s when the first statute was adopted. And they want to establish specific waste treatment methods and specific waste that can be treated. Certain waste is really dangerous to treat, like reactive waste. So that's something that needs a higher tier. Promote safe and effective treatment. That's the philosophy of TIERED permitting. And establishing the ground rules. Businesses are different. People that operate businesses are very different. We're all human, of course. And they need to have ground rules. Some have really good education. They might have a chemical background, some chemistry. But most of the time, the person doing the waste treatment doesn't have the chemistry or the knowledge that they may need, depending on the type of treatment. Again, California is going back since the 70s and 80s regulating treatment. All part of what they call facility permitting. There were thousands of them back then in the beginning that the state would have had to have issued permits for, but that was impossible to do that back when they first began with the law. Again, many thousands would be affected. So in 1992, they created the Treatment Reform Act, saying that we'll have a tiered permitting system. PBR was the tier at the time. And by April of '93, businesses were supposed to notify we treat our waste on site. DTSC was the lead agency at the time. And the tiered permitting established the PBR waste methods, the waste classification, the waste treatment, and the methods that were allowed. Okay. And then over the next several years, a lot of amendments occurred to tiered permitting. Usually exemptions, conditional exemptions, silver recovery, photo processing waste, laboratory waste treatment, those kinds of things. There's all kinds of exemptions. There's probably about 15 or 16 I can think of. So First Estate was in charge in the early 90s with tiered permitting. Then they delegated it to the CUPAs. It was around 96. And then really in our county, and I think most other counties, we really didn't get into on-site tiered permitting inspections until like 99, 2000. It took a while for all of us to ramp up, to understand the regulations. They're not easy to understand, and to go out there and do the inspections. So why regulate treatment? I get that question sometimes. If it goes wrong, it could really be bad. All these kinds of problems can occur. The treatment may not be effective. It may just be a sort of a poorly done method of treating waste. Unsafe storage and accumulation. Some people will batch treat. They'll get a lot of it, then they'll treat all at once. It may not be safe sometimes. There can be odors, fumes, noxious gases can occur with bad treatment. Fire and explosions. We've had treatment occur where there's been fires with oxidizing waste and resin waste. Usually we have resin fire. Chemical reactions occur that they didn't plan for. Tank and container problems, pressure buildup, ruptures have occurred in our county. Of course, subsurface contamination. The philosophy of tiered permitting was if you're doing PBR and conditionally authorized, the whole facility should be assessed for contamination, both past and present, to see whether or not there's been any releases to the soil and groundwater, from fence line to fence line, not just where the treatment unit is located. Untrained workers doing the treatment, and then people getting exposed. We've had treatment gone bad where people have gotten exposed to usually a vapor, gas, and they had to evacuate the area because somebody mixed two things they shouldn't mix. There's been a lot of news attention on stuff that goes wrong. Treatment can be, of course, dangerous to scientists, rocket scientists who are doing treatment, illegal treatment. I think it was Ventura County, and they blew themselves up and died. They had a bunch of old reactive waste from their rocket fuel R&D, very, very reactive, very explosive. And they were shutting down the lab. They wanted to get rid of some waste, put it outside, started designing the method to destroy it, but it blew up as they were doing it. And so, of course, the employer was held accountable and lots of lawsuits by the family members, and OSHA, FBI, everybody investigated this one. Anybody from Ventura? This one?
No, this is a good point. This is a good time to point out, though, that to reinforce what John said earlier, tiered permitting isn't for everything. This is one of those where this wouldn't have fit in even if they would have tried to do it legally.
Yeah. This is San Diego County, one of our metal finishing platers. His idea for treatment was, our inspector saw some PVC piping leaving the ground floor of a building, in a one-story commercial building, and pumping upward to the roof. So the inspector went up on a ladder, and on top of the roof, he was treating his waste by evaporation, his rinse water waste, which was pH below 2 and high in nickel. So it was his idea to treat it with wading pools and use the sun to evaporate. So.
Did a good job with secondary containment, though.
Yeah. All these, of course, laws and regulations you can find online. Fixed treatment unit is what the CUPAs regulate. Stationary piece of equipment, again, performs treatment on site, permanently stationed, doesn't get moved around from location to location, off-site, and then performs treatment. So Coupas do fixed treatment unit. We'll talk about transportable treatment units in a little bit. The definition of a unit is very important because I know Mickey can share his thoughts about it, but when you do a SIRS notification, you're supposed to describe how many units you have, how many PBR, how many conditionally authorized, how many conditionally exempt tiers. And deciding what is a unit with all the piping going into different tanks at different stages can be interesting. A lot of times on the tier permitting notification, they'll say 1 unit, but the CUPA inspector will go out and look at it, look at the plot plan, and say, no, you have 2 units. You have cyanide treatment over here in a separate tank, doing batch treatment, and over here you've got your pH adjustment, your metal precipitation, flocculation. And so we sometimes will correct the business if they have more than 1 unit. And sometimes the incentive to have 1 unit is the CUPA fees. We do by tier in our county. I think most counties do. If you have 1 unit, you pay less, annual fees to the CUPA. If you have 5 units, you pay 5 times the annual fees.
And we do not do that. We just charge by the level. So.
Yeah. And of course, the most common tiered permitting unit is wastewater treatment in California. That's the one we see mostly. Again, wastewater treatment unit designed to treat influent hazardous waste, and then generates the wastewater for treatment. So very key definition, because knowing what is the wastewater treatment unit versus what is the wastewater accumulation, what is wastewater recycling, kind of important to know the difference. With wastewater treatment units, some generators will give the CUPA inspector some analytical data on some samples of the wastewater and give it to the inspector and say, hey, I see my waste is not hazardous. Sometimes what they're doing is they're giving the inspector samples that are done after treatment or post-treatment, and then the meeting the sewer discharge requirement. So those are after treatment, so it doesn't really define what's going into the unit, which is what we regulate, because of course hazardous waste is regulated at the point of generation, and after it's treated, it should meet sewer discharge limits, pH, metals, etc. In our county, we have mostly heavy metals, aqueous metals solutions, pH adjustment, metal precipitation, flocculation, sludge compaction. Those are the most common wastewater treatment units. We also have oil water separators. The Navy bases have massive oil water separators above ground that are conditionally authorized. That's the most common. Is wastewater treatment in your county? Yeah.
All right, so John's kind of laid out the framework for where the rule is. Before we get into what the rules actually are, I'm going to tell you or give you some of the ways to get out of the rule. John had pointed out that in the genesis of this program, there was the law and the regulation came in, and then over 4 or 5 years between the implementation of the program and kind of where it fell to, there were a lot of carve-outs that were put in. I was one of those people that was lucky enough to work at the state when they put this in, and we spent a lot of time at trophy shops regulating them hypothetically under PBR. Think about that for a minute. Yes, engraving. So things do change. In order, obviously, to talk about what isn't treatment, you know what is treatment. So there's 2 different definitions of treatment. One's in 25.123.5 of Health and Safety Code. The other is in Title 22, 66.260.10, the definition section. You will find that they are not identical, but very similar in that it talks about a method, technique, or process, changing physical, chemical, or biological character or composition, changing physical, chemical, biological character composition. It has to be done to a hazardous waste. And then one of the differences, here it says, or removes or reduces harmful properties. And then it says here, or removes and reduces harmful properties and characteristics for any purpose. Okay? So the 4 parts you need to remember there, you're doing something that changes something, has to be to a hazardous waste, and the treatment should result in a removal or reduction of harmful properties or characteristics. So some of these exemptions we'll talk about kind of tried to clarify that a little bit because there's been some questions over time. There is another section in 25179 which talks about treatment also. This section is a part of law that deals with the treatability of waste for the purposes of land disposal. It's very similar to the other two. It's not as broadly applied as the other two general definitions because this would only apply if the waste that you're performing treatment on is eligible for or headed for potentially or subject to land disposal restriction. So if you're just doing simple neutralization to a POTW, this would never apply. Yeah. So what is treatment? Since I gave you a definition, is stomping on grapes to release the extractable, fermentable sugar solutions treatment. You're taking grapes, you're stepping on them. What comes out of the bottom? Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. Yeah, so I'd say that you're changing a grape from a solid to a wine, well, soon to be fermented wine, which is now a liquid, which that's changing the physical composition of the waste. Now, is that treatment of a hazardous waste? No, at that point I would imagine that grapes are probably not terribly hazardous, otherwise I wouldn't shove them in my kid's face all the time. Question?
No, that was it.
Okay. See, somebody's already ahead of me. How about putting an ice cube in your overly hot coffee? You're diluting it, right? Are you? Or are you just cooling it off? Is that changing the physical characteristics of the waste? Some people might argue yes. I would say no. How about adding Coke to your tumbler of Jack Daniels? That was definitely treatment. It treats you well. And if you haven't figured that out by Thursday morning, well, I don't know where you've been hiding this week. Adjusting pH of a metal-bearing rinse water. That one should get some people nodding yes and some people going, well, I'm not so sure. And I say that because the word I put up there was adjusting the pH. So the question you need to ask yourself at that point is, because treatment is treatment of a hazardous waste, is that metal-bearing rinse water hazardous because of its pH or its metal content? And if it's not hazardous for either of those, you can pH adjust to your heart's delight and never call it treatment because you're not treating hazardous waste. Crumpling up dirty gloves and throwing them in the drum, you're changing the physical shape of something. John's over here smirking because we've had this discussion about 500 times about whether smashing things is treatment or not. And then evaporating a liquid. And again, that one should be fairly straightforward in that you need to ask yourself, is the liquid that's being evaporated hazardous prior to its being evaporated? And if it's not hazardous, you don't have to worry about the treatment of hazardous waste. Okay, on to the things that if you are treating a hazardous waste, that you can do to those hazardous wastes and not have to have a permit. I am not going to go into these in depth because there's a bunch of them. What I'd like you to note is that I tried to bunch them. So you'll see here, there's an exemption for air pollution control devices, and there's two different sections that reference or refer to that. But then you have filtering, phase separation, mixing, and evaporation. And they're all in Health and Safety Code 25123.5. So that was one bill that came in, did a whole bunch of cleanup at the same time. Just know that what I'm giving you here are the very, very shorthand versions of these exemptions. There are almost always conditions that go with exemptions. You can only filter for the removal of solids prior to XYZ. Phase separation, only if no heat added other than ambient sunlight. Things like that. Okay. I think we all generally recognize that recycling, and by recycling I say legitimate recycling, stuff that qualifies under 143.2 is going to get you out of tiered permitting. And that's just kind of, I call that the eraser. Reusable textile materials. Think about it for a second. You have a rag or some other piece of cloth, which may or may not be, or probably is contaminated with a hazardous waste, and you are allowed to send it off-site to give it to somebody else who can launder it without a permit. So that's not really a tier permitting exemption per se, but it is an exemption from some of the management and handling that leads to the treatment of a hazardous waste. Silver was a huge change in the rule, 143.13. Backed us down to regulating silver the same way the feds would. Laboratories, the 25.200.3.1. This is a good one to know, to bookmark, to asterisk, to scribble a note on. If you have a laboratory, and there's a pretty broad definition of what a laboratory is, everything from school to QA/QC, pathology. What am I missing?
Biotech.
Yeah. Just anything that looks like a lab, smells like a lab.
Colleges, universities, yeah.
This section has kind of two different parts to it. One is allowing for relaxed management of waste, and the second part of 200.3.1 allows for the on-site treatment of waste. And again, there are conditions there, but there are the conditions. As long as those conditions are met, you don't have to get a permit to do that. Which is really nice for a lot of laboratories because they do generate a lot of functioning, not research type labs, tend to generate the same waste over and over and over and over. And if they have a procedure and they can find a procedure that fits, they can go ahead and treat that waste without having to generate, store, accumulate, and dispose of that waste in drums, buckets, and other things. If you've ever spent time in labs, you know there's no room for anything anyway.
Yeah, with labs, we have a lot of labs doing treatment, exempt treatment in San Diego. And sometimes they get into tiered permitting violations when they they accumulate all their laboratory waste and want to treat it. Well, one of the conditions is you have to treat within 10 days of generation. You can't store it for 180 days and treat it. They have to be able to reference like a prudent practices, which is a national standard for treating laboratory waste. And there's a quantity limitations and record keeping, employee training goes along with it. But generally the 10-day rule is where some of our labs get in violation, where they'll have a whole bunch in a hood, and the inspector will ask, how long has that been there? You're gonna treat it. Oh, it's been here a month. Then they get a violation for tiered permitting because they're gonna treat it or have been treating it more than 10 days. The idea is you don't want the labs to accumulate a lot of waste and treat some of that stuff in a batch sort of scenario.
Yeah, any laboratory that accumulates a lot has a problem anyway because they don't have any space for it.
Yep.
It's good labs. Aerosol cans, there's a provision that allows for the puncturing and capture of contents of aerosol cans, again, with conditions. Food waste exemption up here is for the neutralization of acid or alkaline materials used to clean food waste machines. If you've ever worked in a food processing plant, obviously fairly high standards of cleaning, have to use strong acid or strong bases, and this allows them to do some of that neutralization without having to have the permit. Glutaraldehyde, as long as you have a glycine-based active ingredient, you can go ahead and treat out glutaraldehyde without getting a permit. Cutting oils, allowing people to clean cutting oils for reuse. PERC dry cleaning solvents, the evaporation to allow the separation of the PERC portion of the dry cleaning solvent from the water. This obviously is not as big a deal now as it was 5 years ago, as people have moved away from PERC dry cleaning solvents into the DF2000s and D5s and which one am I forgetting? Rhinex. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Green Earth, yeah.
So, as they've moved into all these alternate cleaning solvents, this has become less and less prevalent. Just a note to the wise, you'll still find a lot of dry cleaners who will try and treat their dry cleaning evaporator water or split out water using this because that's the way they've always done it. Just be aware that the law specifically says PERC containing. So you may have to have that discussion with them that that's the condition. Of course, that generally leads to questions about whether or not that separator water is actually even hazardous at the point that they're doing the treatment on it. There's a biotechnology exemption for if you fit the very narrow definition of a biotechnology facility. You can do certain waste treatments, mostly neutralization, without any type of permit. Appliance recyclers allows you to go into appliances and poke holes in things and destroy other things to remove freons, oils, mercury switches. Well, forgetting something. Yeah. Oil and fuel filters. I put this one up there just because I like to. Everybody here realizes that oil filters are allowed to be crushed, poked, smashed, cut, destroyed, so long as they do that to facilitate the removal of any excess oil. Yes, anyone here ever seen an oil crusher? Can crusher? Think about that for a minute. If the filter itself would qualify as a hazardous waste, then the act of putting holes in it or smashing it down to squeeze stuff out of it to make it less hazardous and more recyclable would be treatment. So this is a pretty broad exemption. And then if a facility is operating a groundwater treatment system under a RAW or a RAP, which is a remedial action work plan or remedial action plan, generally issued by the water board, then they don't need a tier permit for that. They're already covered by the actions. Their actions are being dictated by another regulatory agency, and therefore they don't need to ask your permission to do it. So those are mostly, you'll notice that those were all health and safety codes. There's a couple that are hiding in Title 22. We just go to, I'll just leave them there. Adding absorbent to container, just point out that one, again, with conditions, the absorbent should go into the container prior to the waste being added to the container. Obviously, this was put in so that people could add materials to a container and have the absorbent there as a means to control the free liquids. But again, the condition there is that the absorbent goes into the container prior to the rest of the waste being added. This is not, I fill up my drum with oil filters and then I take my oily absorbent and pour it over the top because now I can get rid of my oily liquid. That's not how it's supposed to work. And then if you're doing emergency response, you're allowed to do treatment in the commission of that response to try and mitigate the emergency. And that can be done without a permit.
Well, for absorbent, it sounds pretty simple, but I'll tell you one that we had a couple years ago that went first to us and then to the state. Costco has their ink cleaning cartridge machine. And when they clean the ink, it's a process, it generates a liquid waste, and then it goes down into a reservoir. And in the reservoir, Costco was preloading it with some kind of like absorbent material. And we were looking at the absorbent material, is this an absorbent or a fixing, encapsulation material? And so they wanted an opinion from San Diego County about whether or not it was considered to be treatment. Because they say it was an absorbent, but if you looked at the literature on the type of media, it was sort of a beyond absorbent. It was sort of a fixing it, making it what they call stabilization.
Encapsulation, yeah.
Encapsulation, yeah. So we had to study the absorbent, we had to study, of course, the waste. And ultimately, we looked at it and decided it was absorbency. Therefore, they came under this exemption because they were trying to treat it. They would bag it up and then put it as a solid waste and dispose of it versus handling the liquid waste, which they didn't want to do, and pour it into a drum. Then they went to the state. DTSC asked the same question because other CUPAs had brought up, hey, this might be treatment, not just simple absorbent use. And then the state wrote a letter, Charles Corcoran wrote a letter saying, we agree it's absorbent and not encapsulation or stabilization. So it was something real simple, probably took many hours because we were trying to, our Coupa, like many of you Coupas, we don't want to set a precedent that's wrong, especially with a big company that's going to go, oh, well, San Diego says, or Mickey says, that it's okay, it's absorbent. And so we're real careful on that because, as you all know, you write a letter, all of a sudden it's used in all the different Coupa jurisdictions. LA says it's okay, and then a consistency issue comes up, as you guys know.
And the moral of that story is don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah.
Question?
Or something else.
Okay, so if I can re-paraphrase that, if you're adding something that results in an exothermic reaction, would that meet that qualification? And I would say no. That's not simple absorption.
Right, that would be like adding a cementous agent.
That would be adding cement or stabilization, yeah. Which would require a permit. May not be allowable under tier permitting, but we'll look at that later. Yeah.
Filter that are going offsite for recycling?
Do I find people putting absorbent in drums of oil filters to sort of rid them of the excess oil? The answer is yes. Again, the big battle there for me, at least, is getting the people to put the absorbent in prior to adding the filters and not just dumping their semi-oily absorbent on top.
We had a major, go ahead. What's the question? We had a major retailer, national retailer, that they were getting in trouble with some of the Coupas and with the state. And so they paid their fine and got their whole environmental program ramped up to meet generator requirements. But what they did then was, because they're having so much trouble with their employees and classifying the waste, deciding what to do with it, and they didn't want to deal with liquids, they had gotten bags, special bags from Stericycle, put absorbent in the bags. Whenever they had a damaged product or a leaking product, they would take it off the shelf at the retail display area, go to the back with that leaker or that damaged one that the customer's not going to buy. They would pour it into the bag with absorbent, massage it in the back room, and then throw that, they double bag it and then throw it into a drum. And they were making a lot of solid waste. I initially had a lot of questions about that. And
it's funny you should say that, John. We're dealing with a major retailer on that same issue right now.
Yeah, and it was because it was part of a settlement. It got elevated to DTSC, and we were debating it, and it was dealing with different waste, such as a pesticide container that had leaked, like Roundup, pool chemicals, disinfectants, sanitizers, oil, fuel. So we were troubled by it, but ultimately, the decision was from an attorney, a county counsel who we go to, saying they're meeting the exemption and it's not treatment. But OSHA had issues because the workers, being paid barely over minimum wage, they're massaging this stuff. They're told to massage it into the absorbent. There's vapors, especially with pesticides and strong chemicals. So I think OSHA might have.
Yeah, we've actually had some questions about the corporate policy that says that undamaged goods should be allowed to be poured out to be adsorbed or solidified prior to. Mm-hmm. And it's taking something that's whole and intact and opening it up for exposure, and then basically
so you'll see
managed
some
the same way.
real creative kind of things, and it'd be like, well, is it treatment? Because if it didn't want to be tiered permitting, obviously. Ultimately, it got down to the lawyers deciding what was legal.
Okay, so the question is whether or not maybe for the food waste exemption that I spoke of, whether or not that might apply to someone who's using food grade materials, would be otherwise regulated by FDA, but it maybe is not processing food, whether that exemption would apply. I would have to pull it up, but off the top of my head, I would say no. I say that I think that exemption is fairly specific to food processing facilities. I think they use that phrase.
Yeah, and I think they reference SIC codes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to have a SIC, Standard Industrial Classification Code, to meet it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I know there was a cosmetic manufacturer in Los Angeles that tried to use this once and was told no, they couldn't do that. Basically using the same thought process logic.
According to the lawyers, the question is, did a plastic bag meet the definition of a container? And according to lawyers, yeah, it did. Portable device designed to, accumulate, transfer, store waste. And then they were double bagging it and then putting it in a drum. So yeah, they said, even the DTSC concurred that a bag could be considered a container.
All right. So those are a bunch of little ones. Obviously the largest and most often applied exemption from on-site treatment or requiring a permit is recycling. And I'm just going to breeze through recycling pretty much. Go look in Health and Safety Code 25143.2. There's really 3 sections that talk about recycling or how recycling needs to take place. There's B, C, and D. Boy, cat, and dog. B doesn't apply very well when you talk about treatment, and that's because the language in 25143.2B talks about a material not being reclaimed. So this would be using something and then taking it somewhere else and using it as is. No cleaning, no filtering, no scrubbing, no solidifying, no changes. You just take it, use it here. You walk it over here and you take it and use it over here. Think a cleaning solvent. So if a solvent was used for ultra high purity cleaning over here and then was taken and used across the process or across the plant for something other than parts cleaning, then that might be recycling as long as it was done without changing that solvent in any way, shape, or form. That's what we're talking about here in B. The thing that should catch your eye there is that we're talking about using something without changing it in any way, shape, or form. So B really doesn't apply very well when you talk about exemptions from treatment because B says you can't treat stuff.
Yeah, we call that like the as-is exemption. You have a waste or something that's spent and somebody else can use it as is without doing any kind of treatment.
C, we find a little more frequently. C says maybe recycle at the facility that's not authorized. You don't need a permit. The C conditions are allowable for both RCRA and non-RCRA waste. The caveat on C is that basically what we have is the stuff continues, the thing that is being recycled continues to need to be managed as a hazardous waste. So it has to be, the processing or the treatment and the recycling has to be done within the applicable time limits, accumulation time limits. And then up until the point that they have been processed for reuse, they are still subject to all hazardous waste law rules, applicable rules. And then probably the broadest exemption or exclusion, this is technically an exclusion, is D. And the caveat on D is that the D only applies to non-RCRA hazardous waste. And I say non-RCRA hazardous waste, but what I mean is wastes which are not regulated by RCRA, either because they are California only or because they are otherwise exempt under RCRA for whatever reason. So just don't be confused when I say non-RCRA waste. I don't mean California only there. So this says that if you meet the conditions, what you have is an excluded recyclable material. You don't have a hazardous waste. And then there's a whole bunch of different sections within subsections within D that allow for specific treatments. One of the examples I put up there was D5C and D6C. It'll say the material is not being treated except by one or more of the following, and one or more of the following, there'll be like 6 different technologies that can be applied: sieving, straining, pressing, things like that. So it is very, the conditions to be met to have the exemption are very specific and need to be maintained to maintain that exclusion. But if you can do that, you get out of managing that material as hazardous waste and thus don't need a permit. So it's kind of a +2 on that one.
And with recycling, what we train our inspectors is that if they're claiming we recycle, well, if they're not meeting all the conditions, then they're treating, and the tier permitting regulations come into play. So it's a common, it used to be a common violation. Now businesses have learned to have recycling records, recycling systems, recycling proof, legitimate, significant percentage, not 1%, 99% goes to sewer. Kind of an example that we've seen in the past. So then the tier permitting Coupa checklist comes out. And so the business is shocked that they have to comply with tier permitting, but if they can't prove recycling and they're doing something to manage or treat the waste, it's treatment.
Okay, and then I'd be a little remiss if I talked about recycling without talking about the little thing that gets tacked onto the end. It says, oh, by the way, all those things that we already just talked about in B, C, and D, those are all wonderful, but yeah, it's got that notwithstanding word. And then it says in E, nope, you can't do it if it's going to end up being burned for energy, applied to the land, or accumulated speculatively. And these are obviously, as inspectors, these are kind of the pry bar or the hammer that you can use to get people to show the legitimacy of the recycling rather than some sort of sham processing just for the purposes of changing it so it looks better and I can then, say, oh yeah, look, I make paving bricks. Well, that's nice. I like to compare the simplicity of recycling to the simplicity of baseball. Because baseball, we all know, is a very simple game. Because there's 2 teams, the one out, one in. The one that's in sends players out one at a time to see if they can get in before they get out. And if they get out before they get in, they come in, but it doesn't count. But if they get in before they get out, then it does count. All right? Now, when the ones that get 3 outs are the ones that get in before going out, the team that's out comes in. The team that goes out because they're going to get in without being out. Now, when both teams have been in and out 9 times, the game is over. And the team with the most in without being out before coming in wins unless they're equal. Okay? In which case, the last ones in get to be the ones to come in before they get in without being out. Got that? That's kind of what reading recycling feels like half the time. So we'll let John talk about some of the specifics of tier permitting and where this thing fits into the regulatory schema and start talking about the specifics of tier permitting itself.
Okay. So there are 5 tiers. We'll go through those in depth for the next half hour or so. And each tier is designed to meet the risk or the regulatory requirements for each tier. Higher tiers, more risk, more waste being managed. The first is the full permit tier, which is your RCRA facility. About 100 permits, 100 plus permits in the state of California for RCRA permits, full RCRA permits, or standardized permit, I should say. Landfills, incinerators, those kinds of big operations. And of course, the DTSC is the lead agency. The second is the standardized permit tier. It's, again, typically your off-site commercial hazardous waste treatment, storage, disposal facility, TSDF, for non-RCRA waste that California regulates. So that's where a lot of the recyclers that are doing California hazardous waste recycling off-site facilities, I have to clarify that, they come under standardized permit. Precious metals, used oil processing facilities, those are the ones that are typically standardized permitted. And again, DTSC is the lead agency. The third one, permit by rule. Now we're starting to get into the three three levels that are regulated by CUPAs. On-site treatment, this is the PBR tier that allows it. You can treat as much as you want under this tier. There's no volume limit. And waste that has multiple hazards. It could be corrosive, it could be toxic. That's common. And again, the CUPAs are the lead agency. The next tier below PBR is conditionally authorized. There are volume limits with this tier, again, enforced by the CUPA. And it's single hazard waste streams. So you can't have waste that has multiple hazards or multiple characteristics. So something that has like aqueous with metals that's not corrosive could be covered by this tier for removing the metals from wastewater. But if it's also corrosive and has heavy metals in solution, it'd be PBR. And again, this has volume limits associated with the tier. And again, the CUPAs are the lead agency. We call that the CA tier. Conditionally exempt is the fifth tier, the lowest amount of regulation, on-site treatment again. Low risk treatment is designed under this tier in the law. And I give you some examples up there that are common. And again, the CUPAs are a lead agency. The last three tiers, PBR, CA, and CE, it's all should be done in SIRS by the generator, by the treater, notifying the CUPA 60 days before starting treatment. Okay. The upper two tiers handled by the state, much different process. Usually takes a couple years, have to go through CEQA, have to go through all kinds of pre-notice requirements, public hearings, and so forth. But these lower three tiers are designed for notifying in SIRS, meeting the treatment requirements, and getting a successful inspection.
So if I can just, because even though the lower three tiers, PBR, CA, and CE, are what we as CUPAs are primarily responsible for, does that not mean that you are prohibited from visiting full TSD permit or standardized permit facilities as a CUPA? You're just limited to regulating them for their on-site generated activities that are not covered by their permit. That's the caveat there.
Mm-hmm. The CE tier has subdivisions within it, several of them. The first is conditionally exempt small quantity treatment. This is unique because you can do hazard waste that has two or more hazardous characteristics, corrosive, toxic. But you're allowed to do under CE tier, but you have a volume limit, 55 gallons, 500 pounds in a month. I think it's just 55 gallons, I can't remember. But, and it allows you to not have to do all the PBR, and the idea being it's a low quantity every month, and you're allowed to do it under CE tier. Businesses like the CE tier because there's not a lot of bells and whistles that go along with it. They sometimes don't like PBR because PBR is almost like having a big old permit because you have to meet all kinds of conditions for PBR. So. CESW, conditionally exempt specified waste stream. They have a list of the waste streams that are allowed. No volume limit on this one. Things like drum washing, resin treatment, things like that. Known waste with kind of minimal or moderate risk of treatment, where there's not a big potential to have a consequence. That's the concept. Conditionally exempt limited, we'll go through that in a little detail, very limited exemption tier. And then CECL, conditionally exempt commercial laundry. Mickey was talking about laundering reusable rags and towels. If it's done, they have to go through by a commercial laundry or by on-site laundry, and it's contaminated rags and towels that meet a toxic requirement, like metals on rags and things like that. Then you go through CECL if you're treating those rags or washing them.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out here that part of the reason that tier permitting, I think tier permitting is difficult at times, is if you look up here, John's just put out 4 different types of conditionally exempt treatments, and each one of them has a different authorizing section in health and safety code. So this is one of the problems that you have with tiered permitting is you can't find it in one place. I mean, you might have to go to any one of 5 different or 6 different places just to find out if a treatment is authorized, eligible, et cetera, et cetera. This program does not have a one-stop shop for what to do, which I think is one of the shortfalls of it, and one of the things that makes it so difficult.
And commercial laundries, they're very, it can be challenging. Treatment is pretty, how hard is it to wash the rags and towels and remove the oils and the metals and things like that. But they have a tendency to burn down because of the spontaneous combustion of rags. We had 2 of them burn down in our county in the last 20 years, where they're taking all this, soiled rags with oils and paint, and they, middle of the night, fire starts in a rag pile or a drum, and the whole place burns down. You called me, 2-3 years ago on a place that was in San Diego, and then now in San Diego, a lot of the laundries, they burned down. They didn't rebuild them. They went to Mexico, and they're doing it down there. So. What about transportable treatment units? The state is the lead agency on that. Again, these are units that move from location to location, typically run by a contractor. They can go across county lines, across city lines, and then DTSC is the lead agency on that. So we don't regulate, CUPAs don't regulate transportable treatment units. Makes sense, because I can't regulate a treatment unit that's based in LA, that's coming down to San Diego for a month and going back to LA, because it's crossing the county line. For all the tiers, there's kind of like the on-site tiers. There's 4 kind of upfront conditions. Waste is hazardous at the point of generation. Okay. And of course, always the generator's got to classify it properly. It's got to be generated and treated on site. So they can't take it from one city to another city to treat it and call it, PBR, CA, or CE. It'd be possibly a transportable treatment unit situation. It's got to be eligible and allowed for the treatment process itself. And they got to notify the CUPA within 60 days using SIRS before treating. Determining the treatment tier is a key part of the decision making. The generator should get it right. A lot of times it becomes a question of whether or not they're in the right tier. In the old days, we had, I think businesses would under-notify. They would say CA tier, but then the inspector would go out and they under-notified, they really were PBR. So that would be a discrepancy in the report. The business had to redo their notification. And that was before the flow chart, the DTSC has. But under-notifying can happen. So if you're an inspector, look for that. Somebody will say they're a CE tier. And then you're like, wait a second, you're not CE, you're PBR. So. And then, of course, the operator's got to follow the rules and regulations for the tier. The point of waste generation is key. It's not after treatment. It's when it's first generated. So a lot of times businesses will take samples, again, after treatment and give that data to the inspector, showing very, very trace levels of heavy metals and things like that. But it's got to be done at the point of generation, which can be 2, 3, 4 dozen locations at a big facility.
Yeah, I find that point of generation is probably most difficult when there's commingling of aqueous waste, because one process may be, first etch down the drain, and then right next to it in the next sink is first rinse down the drain, and the one to your left is clearly hazardous waste. The one to the middle may or may not be, depending on how many cassettes they add, and then the third one, which is next to it, probably isn't unless they had really bad retention time. So you can have 3 things in a row, all connected to the same pipe, feed under the same desk, and you kind of have to unravel, okay, so that one goes where, why, how, at what point, when you push the button to get rid of it, where is it, what is it?
Yeah. Yeah. And in the, yeah.
Is mixing the waste considered a treatment?
Rinsing waste?
Mixing.
Mixing? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Mixing waste can be considered treatment. Yep. Sometimes we'll have an acidic rinse piped into a combination or what they call aggregation tank. And then they'll have a sort of a basic rinse going into the same tank, and they'll be mixing, the pH will adjust out and things like that. That's considered to be treatment if it's hazardous to begin with, yeah.
Is it acceptable treatment?
Yeah, they have to notify, yeah.
Yeah, and there is one exemption for mixing, but it's very limited.
Yeah, we had a case, a court case where business, the exemption that Mickey brought up a while back, mixing waste is not treatment. And the condition is it has to be compatible waste. Well, the business was mixing acids and bases. We got them for a tier permitting case because they were really being difficult. And so we said, we'll do a case. And so they tried to argue that they were mixing, but the rule is you've got to be compatible. Well, acids and bases aren't compatible. Of course, they wind up losing and having to do tier permitting. They didn't want to do tier permitting, and we ultimately, we were successful in the prosecution. So, yeah.
But some mixing of waste would be acceptable and wouldn't be treatment, because part of the definition of treatment is you're doing it for a reason, right? So say I've got blue paint and I've got red paint, or I've got, they're totally different waste streams, but if they're compatible, and I'm not doing it for anything other than to just put them in one drum, that you can do, and that's not treatment.
Correct, yep. Yeah, mixing different paint waste, things like that, because they're compatible, and that's the key, the compatibility of it. Yeah.
And the treatment's not being done to circumvent a rule, a land disposal restriction, or
dilution.
a sewer, sewer
yeah.
condition, things like that.
Yeah.
Two hazardous waste, you mix them
Yeah.
together so you can ship them out.
Yeah.
That'd be
So if a boat manufacturer is mixing their leftover resins for the sole purpose of solidifying them and not disposing of them,
There'll be treatment. We have, with a boat company or any resin manufacturing, they have leftover and they go ahead and mix A and B. That would be considered CE treatment. Yeah, we regulate that. Yeah, because their leftovers they're going to be discarded, but they decide to treat it by mixing A and B or putting in catalyst or heat or ultraviolet light or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say that meets that definition, those definitions of treatment, because the end goal of that is to end up with a hardened, non-hazardous material rather than having a part A and a part B that I have to deal with as waste, or at least make a waste determination on.
It gets tricky with resins when they've already, it's called pre-preg. They already impregnated the resin, and it cures on its own. It gets hard within a couple days or within 12 hours or something like that. Is that really treatment or just a generator container issue?
Yeah, you cup mix a part A and a part B to apply, and you end up with that
little
extra eighth of an inch. You start questioning whether or not allowing that to sit around becomes treatment or not.
And in our county, we've decided that if you have a little bit of leftover, like in a cup or a container, and it's already pre-impregnated with a catalyst, already mixed, it's going to cure. It's generator standards that we instead of putting them under tier permitting. But if they are deliberately at the end of the day or at the end of the, when they decide and they want to discard it and they start adding heat or chemicals or catalysts, that we consider that treatment. They're doing a method. So treatment determination for tiers. It's important to know, again, the volume and the point of generation. In the example there, you have, waste A and B are non-hazardous, and then C and D are hazardous in these tank situations here. Which waste do you use to evaluate the treatment tier? Well, C and D you're going to be, because they're hazardous, you use those. But because they're adding waste A and waste B, the volume's going up, so you got to consider the volume. If you wanted to reduce waste, if I was a generator, I would not have waste A and B going into the treatment unit and mixing with hazardous waste. But some businesses will pipe it to a treatment unit, and the volume goes up. They may go under a higher tier because of that and have more waste, because that's the way they manufacture. Everything's piped to a common tank for wastewater treatment.
Yeah, if at all possible, work with businesses to see if they can engineer their system to sort of alleviate that. If they have something that just needs a little polishing to take off that extra, 2 parts per million prior to disposal under their POTW permit, maybe that waste stream can be plumbed in after we've done the flocculation, but before it goes through a sand filter or other, physical removal strainer type activity.
Yeah. Some other tier permitting rules that are common and required. It's got to be done for on-site treatment only in a container or a tank. You can't have a waste pile. You can't have a swimming pool or wading pool situation like we had in San Diego. You can't treat waste that's reactive or extremely hazardous waste under the PBR, under any of the on-site tiers. There is an exception, cyanide under PBR. We'll talk about that can be allowed, even though that's considered to be both reactive and extremely hazardous waste. There's a PBR tier. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they allow. You can't treat waste that requires a federal permit. Like, I want to incinerate my waste, you can't do that. I may not treat waste by landfilling and surface impoundments, waste piles, or by burning the waste. We've had businesses say that they would like to use it as a fuel substitute and recycle it on site, and it's not allowed. Under the on-site tiers, you may be able to do that if you're higher tier, standardized permit or full RCRA permit, if you want to use your waste as a fuel, but not under the on-site treatment tiers, PBR, CA, and CE. There's a lot of treatment processes that are allowed, and the ones in red are the most common ones that we've seen notify over the last 20 years in San Diego. We don't see centrifuging a lot. I don't know if you guys do. Biological degradation, I haven't seen that. So we typically have moderate, not really heavy industry in our county. We have the military that does a lot of oil water separation, and some used to have a lot of plating shops, but a lot of them are no longer in San Diego. So this is kind of important for eligibility. A lot of questions a treater have to consider. What is the hazardous waste? Is it hazardous waste, and what amount? And the points of waste generation, the initial points. It's got to be on-site treatment if they want to be under the lower tiers. Tanks, containers have to be used. And then how many treatment units? That could be a little art as well as some science to figure that out. Are they mixing and commingling the waste? Is it not eligible for on-site treatment? And is it conditionally exempt from tier permitting regulation? Like Mickey went through a few slides of exemptions like recycling and solar and things like that. So you ask all these questions, and the treater may actually have an exemption and not have like laboratory treatment of benchtop chemicals and things like that. But every generator treating their waste need to kind of ask these questions and figure out if they're covered by tiered permitting, and then if they meet an exemption. The DTSC has a flow chart, of course, if you guys have seen it, probably many of you have seen it. Waste is here on the left. The type of treatment method is in the boxes there, and then a decision on the right side of the pages. That's how they laid it out in all the pages for the DTSC tier permitting chart. And of course, sometimes you're talking about volume and concentration to make a decision on what tier you come under, whether it be CE, SQT, or conditionally authorized, or PBR. These are kind of important to give on the first page, kind of give the acronyms that everybody needs to follow. This down here is important. Waste is treated solely due to one thing, like corrosivity. So if you see an asterisk, the chart is telling the reader it can only have one characteristic for that particular tier or decision making. Another page, aqueous metals. All the things you can do to that waste stream right here, all the different treatment processes, and the decision on what tier you're under. Evaporation is a common, can be a common exemption if it's being put in a tank or container. No heat, no pressure, no chemicals are added. It's simple evaporation in a closed container Or this was really an industry-led exemption. I think it was Safety Clean that did it. Because sometimes these tanks of waste would have vents for non-volatile waste, and they would evaporate. They're outside, exposed to weather, heat, and they would evaporate. And maybe some inspector went out and said, "Hey, that's treatment. The tank has an open vent," and they went ahead and got a legislative change to say that simple venting, where there's no heat, there's no chemicals, there's no pressure, it's not treatment.
That, as John stated though, that does not mean you can put your waste in a 55-gallon drum in the backyard with the lid off and let it evaporate.
Yeah, still have to meet generator standards. This is just a simple caveat. It doesn't really work for generators, but I think it was a TSDF that might have lobbied for this sort of weird exemption. Eligible waste streams per PBR, there's many of them. You can see on the slide there. Number 2 is very common, the aqueous waste containing toxic metals. And there's quite a bit more. 14 is your cyanide containing waste. Used to be not allowed at all, but about 4, 5, 6 years ago, they put it under PBR if you meet the cyanide management and treatment rules that are under PBR.
And John will show this to you in a little while here, but just note that a business is not restricted to any one activity under PBR. They can put together a series of these types of treatments. So they can choose to do item number 2, and then item number 10, and then item number 13. As long as they're done in a logical sequence, that's allowable. They're not restricted to one treatment process per unit per facility.
And one thing about the different tiers is, like, resins can be treated under PBR, but resins can also be treated under CA or CE. So if you're a generator, do you want to do PBR for resin treatment, or do you want to do CE? PBR started first, they listed everything back when the law or regulations was made back in the early 90s. So they covered all these waste streams, but then they had CA conditionally authorized and CE added years later by legislation. So you'll see the same kind of treatment allowed under different tiers. Generators should be smart and pick the tier that fits for them, and maybe pick the lower tier if they meet their conditions. Because PBR has a lot of rules and regs, as many of you probably know.
I have a question. I saw an exemption for cleaning containers under 110 gallons. And I found a facility with these IBCs that are like 200 gallons. So if that residue is considered hazardous waste, what level tier would they go to if they were going to try and clean those on site?
We had this in San Diego where they were doing IBC cleaning, the big 200-gallon plus totes. Standardized permit is what they were told to do when the state, we referred them to DTSC. Because it's for PBR, you're limited to 110 gallons or smaller.
I live in a rural area, and these IBCs are on the side of the road being sold as water tanks.
Jeez. Yeah. Special waste, subset of hazardous waste. There is some tiers, tier permitting eligibility, but no one ever does special waste because you have to petition DTSC to get approval for your special waste. It's expensive, it's difficult, and I've seen it once in 25 years for some copper-containing waste that was barely over the California limit.
The topic may come up again soon with the auto shredding initiative that DTSC is pushing, but my guess is they'll try and stay away from it as much as possible. Mm-hmm. That being auto shred fluff being one of those special ways.
So for PBR tier, eligibility, again, treat no volume and have 2 or more hazardous characteristics. More regulations than the CE and the CA tier. This tier requires annual notification. That's a biggie in CERS. And then, of course, before they even start treatment, 60-day pre-notice in CERS. Conditionally authorized is a statute, not a reg, but it references regulation in a statute. And they have many waste streams. These are the ones listed. There's two slides here of all the ones that are eligible for conditionally authorized tier. And we see number one being a common one in our county. Water-bearing waste with metals in it, not corrosive, and below 1,400 parts per million total. Some advice, if you get some analytical data as an inspector and they're giving you a bunch of STLC data, it actually says total. And so you want to have the TTLC data or something to that in terms of if it's got any particulates in it that are floating in the sample, because you have to have a complete total amount known for this 1,400 part per million limit here. STLC is a weak digestion, where TTLC is a complete digestion using a stronger acid for dissolving the waste, and to compare it to the regulation for TTLC. Everybody knows TTLC and STLC? Okay. If you don't, Mickey has a class now. And again, these are all the different things that can occur with CA. And some more. Number 9 is common. Elementary neutralization. Yeah.
Sorry to be that person who keeps asking questions.
That's okay.
But number 8, full water separators, I struggle with those because most often the waste going in is not hazardous from our washes, our rooftops. More often than not, it's slightly contaminated water. So it doesn't meet the definition, first of all. So can you kind of clarify full water separators?
Yeah, we have the CA tier, the biggest one that we have in San Diego are the Navy, and they have giant oil water separators with 1 million gallon tanks. And because during the process of treating the bilge water with oils and things like that from Navy ships, they concentrate the used oils and the waste oils and whatever goes into the wastewater. And there's the Navy did studies, and a lot of times it wasn't hazardous, but they had a few times it was hazardous. It spiked for benzene. Like somebody put gas, something with benzene, and it was, benzene is regulated at 0.5 parts per million. It spiked for metals like copper. So they have oil water separators, and the Navy found that about 20% of the time it failed. So they did CA notification. Car washes and stuff, we haven't seen that being treatment or hazardous waste like you mentioned. It's a struggle, but it all depends on. Does the generator have a good handle on what's in the oil, what's in the wastewater? With the industry, sometimes it's episodic. It can one time be non-haz, and somebody puts something in the water or in the oil, and it spikes for lead or something.
Yeah, I think all of our regulated oil water separators are all heavy equipment, where they're really blowing down a lot of oil, hydraulic, metal on metal wear. Exterior engine, so you do get other contaminants in there.
Yeah. And then finishing off with the conditionally authorized tier, used to allow for copper and copper compounds for printed circuit board, but that was sunsetted, no longer applicable. CA tier, similar upfront conditions. Again, the eligibility is for on-site treatment, but only one hazardous characteristic. You go to PBR if you have more than one hazardous characteristic. As more treatment, it's a little more regulation than CE tier, but of course less than PBR. You don't have to do annual notification with CA. That's a good benefit for the business, not having to do annual tiered permitting notification. They have to notify if there's changes to the unit within 30 days of a change, adding more waste, different waste, modifying the treatment unit, adding more piping, another treatment unit tank in sequence. All those modifications have to be done in CERS before they start treating. CESW, again, there's many waste streams that are allowed. This is common for resins, because there's no volume limit, and then rinsing containers. I've gotten questions from industry, if I rinse my container, do I come under CE? Well, I ask them, what are you doing with the rinsate? putting it back in a process. Well, that's not treatment. If they're recycling that rinsate, reusing that rinsate. If they're rinsing out the container and discarding or treating the rinsate or containerizing it for disposal as hazardous waste later, that contaminated container treatment is CE regulated. So it all depends. Business could be smart by avoiding treatment if they can reuse the rinsate legitimately on site as part of manufacturing and waste reduction and source reduction. That's what we try and recommend. Sometimes they can't. They're rinsing in a drum rinsing sink, and they got all kinds of things going on, and they're not going to segregate out the wastewater, which, 1 hour could be acidic, another hour later could be a little bit of basic. An hour later it could have some metals, heavy metals in the rinse water because they're rinsing out something with metals in it, organics, whatever. So. And again, more CESW. All this is in the regulation or in the law as well as in the DTSC flow chart. So it's kind of hard to capture on slides. Again, it's limited to on-site treatment, reduced regulation, and PBR and conditionally authorized, and then no annual notification as well. And again, do it in SIRS. For the last 3 years of SIRS, it's kind of been a benefit and sort of a difficult with SIRS and tiered permitting. But businesses have gotten better. We were talking about that in the beginning. They're doing a satisfactory SIRS notification. And what's weird is they used to do it on paper, and SIRS is really just the same paper, but now electronic. They didn't really change the forms that much. But we get initially, a lot of SIRS not accepting by the regulator. The treater would send in the SIRS notification, and we would just not accept, because they would forget some of the bubbles, some of the radials weren't marked. They would say that they have 1 unit, but we know they had 5 units or something like that. So. CESQT, one PBR tier, same eligible waste streams. So this is, again, volume limit though is key, 55 gallons, 500 pounds. Reduced regulation than the other ones and no annual notification. The conditionally exempt limited, this is used oil water separators. I haven't seen this in my county at all, CEL for that. You have one?
No, we don't have.
Yeah?
We don't have one. I saw one in LA once.
Yeah.
But yeah, and they had done it right. They had the documentation showing the flash point of the oil and the operating temperature of the evaporator separator, and it was bang bang. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And the CEL tier, again, similar to the other CE tier. No annual notification, and again, notifying SIRS. So. For the commercial laundries, it's in the statute, and if they're taking contaminated rags and towels that are hazardous, California hazardous, no free liquids, can't be saturated with ignitable gasoline, ignitable paint, the commercial laundry can apply for a tiered permitting. And again, we used to have 2, but they're no longer around. What's unique is it can be off-site. The commercial laundry doesn't need to be done on-site. There you go.
Let's take a 5-minute break, stand up, dance around, go get a glass of water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do, and then I'll start up in 5.